afternoon, everyone. And I'll fill up some airtime to let the stragglers come in. You're not in the Catholic Center, so don't be worried if anybody has religious objections. But this is one of our, my name is Lynn Brown, Senior Vice President at NYU, and this is one of our newest buildings, and this might be the inauguration of this room. So apologies with still lack of signage and confusion about getting in, but at least you have the honor of knowing you're one of the first tushes on those seats, which I'm sure will mean a lot to you. We're delighted to welcome two actually repeat offenders to NYU and actually honored guests and good friends of the university. But first, let me welcome you all on behalf of the John Brademas Center for the Study of Congress and the Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, who are hosting the event today. And we're delighted to be joined by the founder of the John Brademas Center, President Emeritus of NYU and former member of Congress, John Brademas, who joins us this afternoon. I think there's a punch list for the building, too. The disappearing microphone is one of them. It's certainly this book, this debate, these knowledgeable insiders come to us at certainly a vital time in the history of the country. A lot at stake. The Brademas Center aims to have these kind of dialogues and to bring to New York and to NYU this kind of expertise. One promotional announcement that would, I think, be of interest to everyone in the audience is that NYU will be going to Washington, D.C. Starting this fall. We will open our first ever site in Washington, D.C., just blocks from the Capitol and the White House. And we will be setting up there a study away site for our students, a domestic study away site, and also hope to have it as a vibrant center programming both for the Brademas Center and for NYU generally. So that will be this fall, and we look forward to inviting you and having perhaps the next event there in Washington. Today we welcome two of one of the most nation's respected and known political commentators. They also share a rare distinction of garnering praise from across the political spectrum. There's probably not much that John McCain and Tom Daschle or Bill Clinton and Chuck Hagel agree on, but they agree on the expertise of our two guests. Tom Mann is on your right, the left, as the W. Averill Harriman Chair and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, former Executive Director of the American Political Science Association, and has taught at Princeton, Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, UVA, and American University, and the author of numerous books, articles, and opinion pieces on not only Congress, but the elections, political parties, and the presidency. Norm Ornstein is resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He writes a weekly column for the congressional newspaper Roll Call and is an election analyst for CBS News. And he led a working group of scholars and practitioners who helped shape the McCain-Feingold Act on the public campaign finance reform. So that's their official bio. And just to cover that ground. Oh, and also Tom is, I have to say this, proud parent of an NYU PhD student at our Institute of Fine Arts. So there's always a connection with NYU. But as I say, their official bio, impressive though it is, doesn't begin to capture, I think, the throw weight of these two scholars and their influence on discussions in Washington and way beyond. They're known for their scholarly work, but also work that is publicly accessible. They help shape the dialogue of what people are talking about. And perhaps most important in their line of work, they possess a fine sense of humor, or at a minimum, a fine sense of irony, which is very important in talking about our government, I think. And quite literally, they are the go-to guys in understanding American politics. Speaking as a political scientist myself, although I think I'm in the recidivist category and not a practitioner anymore. But I think what is palpable in their work is the deep respect they have, affection and respect, for our institutions of government and understanding the role they play as institutions. It would embarrass them to put them in the company of our founding fathers, although I'm glad to do that. But what they share with our founding fathers is that understanding that although there's a wide range of expression for personal ambition and partisan loyalty, unless it's connected to our institutions, that we are, if it's not connected to our institutions, we really are at the risk of the lesser angels of our nature, not the better angels. And I think what their work shows, and particularly their latest book, is what happens when ambition becomes unmoored from institutions, when political points are substituted for careful legislating and lawmaking, and when partisan loyalty takes precedence over national interest. And they'll be here to talk more about that. I have learned a lot from them in this way and understanding the importance of our institutions, and I think you will be a beneficiary of that as well. Their previous book together was called The Broken Branch: How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. That was in 2006, when obviously there was, or perhaps still, time to get it back on track. Their latest book, of course, the title is It's Even Worse Than It Looks: How the American Constitutional System Collided with the New Politics of Extremism. And we were talking before about I quake in fear of the next book, which will be Head for the Hills. But I think the format is going to be informal. We're going to open it up for Tom and Norm to have a conversation between themselves and us, and then I think leaving plenty of time for questions. And then they've graciously agreed to stay and do book signings over there to the right. So if you would like to get that will be available after. So without further ado, let me introduce, as they say, two good friends of NYU, Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm going to stand just to stretch out. Lovely introduction. Congratulations on the announcement of your new Washington site. I figure that should lower the approval rating of NYU in the country by at least 40 points. So you're gutsy. I'm glad to see you become part of our community. It's a pleasure, John, to be back at the Brademas Center. We've had the honor and the pleasure of speaking several times in your center and participating in activities here and in Washington. Just listening to those titles, from The Broken Branch to It's Even Worse Than It Looks, suggests that we are prophets of doom, of purveyors of gloom. I want you to know both Norm and I are really optimists about America, American politics, and we really, really wanted to say something that seemed to cut across the grain. You know, everything looked so awful. So we looked to Mark Twain, right? Where else to go? After listening to Richard Wagner's music, he penned the term, it's better than it sounds. Now, it would be nice if we could say it's better than it looks, but alas, that would not be true. It's worse, and it's even worse. We've been watching up close, but also distant, free, independent from the political process, American politics for over 4 decades. We came together from graduate school, the same one, the University of Michigan, about 42 years ago, and we have seen good times and bad times. We've studied American history. We know how our country suffered in periods, how polarized it was, certainly in the lead up to the Civil War at the turn of the 20th century. So we're not suggesting that it was worse than the Civil War, but the very fact that we have to go back to the Civil War to find something comparable gives one a sense of what is going on here. It really is very different than we've seen, but we have been struck by the fact that much of the commentary, much of the analysis, much of the reporting on what is going on leaves us very unsatisfied. We don't think it's got the story right. And sadly, by missing the story, we are disarming the public. The public comes away with this visceral feeling of anger, of dismay, of cynicism about the political process, and they buy into the notion that, they're all the same, there's no difference. The Republicans do this, the Democrats do this. We hear it again and again. And we have written a book to say, we don't think you have it right. And Americans, we think you ought to, we understand you're busy. You've struggling to keep your families whole, to hold jobs, to get jobs, to make your way through some very difficult times. And you don't exactly cogitate on the state of American public life and politics every day, but we know you're frustrated. We know you're angry. Those who choose to vote would like it to make a difference. You want to hold individuals and parties and the system accountable, but we think that you're not seeing what's underneath your frustration, and your natural visceral instincts actually prove to be counterproductive. You manage to reinforce the same dynamic as is the source of your frustration with American politics. In some of our correspondents over the last few days have said, you are the equivalent of the little boy who said, the emperor wears no clothes. You have said something that doesn't get said in polite company by people who are not partisans, making simply a point for short-term political advantage. We wrote a piece for the Washington Post Sunday Outlook, and it was put online on Friday afternoon, printed on Sunday. By within 24 hours of going online, it had gone viral. Norm's son Danny explained to us that going viral means 50,000 people have sort of put you on their Facebook page, have recommended that that you look at this piece, and it's now over 200,000. So we're 4 times plus viral. I mean, we are just blown away by the reactions we're getting. Each of us have had hundreds of emails in addition to the probably 10,000 or 15,000 comments that have come in to the Post. I stopped counting at 5,000. We're hearing from Republicans as well as Democrats, from ordinary citizens who've been thinking these things but not hearing anyone say them. It's really quite stunning and moving. And now, of course, there's some ugly hate mail. I responded to one, is this a threat? It gets a little nasty, but I'd say 95% of the comments that have come into us have been thankful and supportive of what we've said. So we've touched a nerve, struck a chord. I'm not sure why, but we're here today to talk a little bit about our observations and the arguments that help us understand what's going on, and and our thoughts about what to do in the face of what has become a very dysfunctional politics. First, just to get the argument on the table, it is worse for a whole host of reasons. Most importantly, we're coming out of the deepest financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression. And there are things that need to be done, short-term, intermediate-term, long-term, and yet we are caught up in a political process in which the opposition party to the man who sits in the White House now has such powerful incentives to make him fail. It is all-out warfare. It is an extension of the permanent campaign. We have now, in other words, parliamentary-like parties, vehemently adversarial, ideologically coherent and polarized, that is separated by difference in values and beliefs, but acting strategically to advance their goals. Okay, we got parliaments around the world that do okay. What's wrong with that in America? By God, parties stand for something, and it's a good thing they do. But the problem is that we have a set of political institutions that are designed to frustrate majorities, while parliamentary government empowers majorities to act on the basis of their campaign platform, put their programs into place, then have a reasonable period of time in which those policies can play out and they can be held accountable. How does it work here? We set up incentives for the opposition party to use all of the tools available in the American system, which is predicated on some degree of collaboration and cooperation. Sort of the two most salient are the midterm election, which comes 2 years after the initial election, and the Senate filibuster. The two together, the routinization of the filibuster as a minority tactic of opposition and a tactic used to delegitimize, if not utterly nullify, the program of the majority, is the most serious. But you combine that with the normal midterm loss of seats in very difficult economic times, and you quickly move from what seemed after the 2008 election to be a government that was created by the public with substantial Democratic majorities to deal with a crisis, and yet before President Obama was inaugurated, the opposition party had very openly discussed how they would act in unity to oppose him. There was no effort to try to do anything in collaboration with him because there were powerful incentives. In this case, incentives when Democrats are in that position would, to some extent, act on in a similar fashion. So it's the mismatch between parliamentary-like parties in a separation of powers system. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. But to pick up on that second point, there's a second piece of the argument. The parties aren't equal. This is not what scholars would call symmetric polarization. It's asymmetric. That is to say, the Republican Party has become an insurgent outlier. They're ideologically extreme. They reject a century's worth of inherited economic and social policies. They're scornful of compromise, unwilling to recognize any kind of neutral or objective definitions of facts, of evidence, of science, and utterly rejecting the legitimacy of the opposition party and its president. I mean, that is a terrible indictment. Writing those words were a serious business. That's a serious charge. But I think you'll see Norm and I do that not out of spite, but out of sadness, and that's turning into anger about the way in which our political system operates. So we've sort of set ourselves up to fail in dealing with these problems. We have a proliferation of all these bipartisan, nonpartisan groups that are going to find the golden mean to, thus real center to lead us out of this way, all of which assume that the two parties are similarly polarized. It's set up. My dear colleague, Alice Rivlin, sort of begins, I'll be on a program at Brookings with her on Friday. I responded in writing to a piece that she had written. She just testified before the Ways and Means Committee, and she begins with a bipartisan approach to health reform. Alice believes it's not worth talking about anything unless you begin with a political strategy for bipartisan agreement. And I would say that's a strategy for failure, that if you begin there, you basically make concessions. Alice believes the Affordable Care Act ought to be strengthened and improved and continued, not repealed or ignored. Alice thinks cutting taxes anymore is crazy. We have to raise taxes. And yet those two things are insisted upon by the other party, the opposite side. Yet Alice feels obliged still to say, well, we've got to then reform Medicare, and this is a way in which we can do it. But in her case, it's a premium support based on a notion that competition among insurance firms will discipline cost and make it affordable. We can argue about that. I don't think there's a shred of evidence that in a healthcare system where the vast majority of expenditures are made by a small segment of those suffering chronic conditions, and in which decisions for medical care are made by professionals, not by individual members of the public, it's pretty tough to do. But anyways, that's the situation we're in now. There has been a reaction. This is a sort of a counter-reaction. This is the counter-reformation, a way of saying we've got to predicate our recommendations, our actions, immediate term and in the long term, based on what is in fact the reality. And the final point I want to make before turning over to Norm is that we really indict the press. And by that, we talk about the new media and the partisan talk show radio and cable news and some of the sort of highly ideological and partisan blogs. But our real indictment is of the mainstream press. Honest, intelligent professionals trying to do a good job who find refuge in the notion of balance. The way they treat the story is to say, have a Republican and a Democratic spokesman, and to obscure the differences between the party. We say in the book, a balanced treatment of an unbalanced phenomenon distorts reality. I have to tell you this charge and discussion of it has generated some newsroom conversations, editorial conversations. We've had emails from prominent national reporters who said, you're absolutely right, and there's no way I can act on that on the basis of your recommendations. It's a reality that's there. It's true, people who don't like the implications of our argument, that is, those who are avid Republicans say, well, no, that's not right. There's a liberal bias in the press. But alas, there is a bias that prevents the public from seeing the reality and being in a position to act on it. So that's our story. And now Norm is really going to fill in the pieces. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to.
You can use your,
Yeah.
Norm, they'll turn your.
I want to add my thanks to NYU and the Brademas Center for hosting us. It's always a pleasure to be here, and it's a particular pleasure to be in the presence of John Brademas, who we've known actually just about all the time that since we came to Washington. Lynn was in kindergarten at that point. But you know, John was always a role model for us for what a public servant ought to be, and then of course went on to a distinguished career helping build this great university and this center. And congratulations on the new Washington Center. I know I talked to Lynn a number of times. It was difficult to find a space. They had to do 4 GSA conferences before they could actually come up with one. And thank you all for coming in this not great weather. When I woke up this morning, it was 61 and foggy, just like Rick Perry. I miss Rick Perry. I think my favorite moment of the campaign came when he was asked what he would do about the West Bank, and he said he'd bring back free checking. And I miss my fellow Minnesotan, Michelle Bachmann. My favorite moment there was when she wished Elvis a happy birthday on the anniversary of his death, but then apologized to Elvis and the entire Costello family. And today's an auspicious day. Newt Gingrich is dropping out of the race. Of course, there were some crackling moments of anger and recriminations with Gingrich and Mitt Romney along the way. Of course, Gingrich opposed most of Romney's positions, but to be fair, Romney opposed most of Romney's positions. But now I actually, as we're turning to talk of a running mate, I think the perfect balanced ticket is Romney-Gingrich. You get a Mormon and a polygamist. Of course, Rick Santorum emerged for a while. I saw him when he was a front runner, and he had just gotten a Secret Service detail, which of course is a sign that you've made it, and he was both excited and apprehensive at the same time. It was the first time he'd ever used protection. But now he's gone, and we're left with Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. And Ron Paul, I've been rooting very much for Ron Paul. Of course, he's for legalization of prostitution and legalization of drugs, and I just want to be at the victory party. But the fact that he's for legalization of prostitution has meant that he has the most robust Secret Service detail of any of the candidates. So we like to get you laughing because it's all downhill from this point on. So let me just embellish a little bit on what Tom has said and just reiterate. We have been in Washington now for more than 42 years. And during that time, we really have been immersed in the politics of the city and the country at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. When we came, it was a pretty tumultuous and difficult time. The country and the city were riven over the Vietnam War. But what was striking about that was that divisions over Vietnam, just as divisions over the great defining issue of the, I would say even of the 20th century in the country, civil rights, were not partisan issues. When we arrived and Richard Nixon was president and the Democrats controlled Congress, the strongest supporters of Nixon's policy and American involvement in Vietnam were really the Southern conservative Democrats who controlled most of the power positions. And among the most vehement opponents of Nixon on Vietnam were liberal Republicans, moderate Republicans, like New York's own Jack Javits and Charlie Goodell, Oregon's Mark Hatfield. If you go back to the civil rights era with Robert Caro's new book out reminding us again of Johnson's pivotal role, The fact is that we would never have had a Voting Rights Act or a Civil Rights Act if it weren't for Everett Dirksen working with Lyndon Johnson and overcoming the Southern Democrats by providing Republican support. And the same is true of an unsung hero of America, Congressman McCulloch of Ohio, who was a pivotal figure in the House of Representatives. So we didn't define things in quite the same way. There was plenty of partisanship, and that's healthy and it's necessary in a democracy. But we viewed it in a different way. And of course, we used to think about governing decisions, and more often they were made by a conservative coalition. The Southern conservative Democrats would join with Republicans to make majorities, and majorities were somewhere around the middle. It's different now, very different. We have no more center in Washington, certainly. And what we've seen is that if the disappearance of the center began in Congress and in Washington, it's metastasized out to states, and we have the same kind of acrimony. We have seen the emergence and now virtual takeover of the system of the permanent campaign. There's no more season of governing where you try and solve problems. It's all campaigning all the time. The stakes are high when the parties are so polarized, and the idea of working with somebody on the other side is now sleeping with the enemy. And if you do that, you get punished. Bob Bennett got punished. There's a very good chance in John's own Indiana that Dick Lugar is going to face that same punishment. And the idea, of course, he's been there 36 years. It's not a great time to be a veteran. But the fact is, the challenge to him is less because he's been around too long, and far more because he thinks in a fashion that doesn't march in lockstep with a party that has, as Tom said, moved off onto the edges of our policy process. When we look at the two parties and the polarization that's taken place, we use the familiar, if sometimes too often used, football field analogy. But basically, we believe the Democratic Party has moved from where it was when we first got to Washington, somewhere around the 40-yard line, to maybe the 25. And I must say we're getting pushback from many people on the left who say the Democrats have actually moved to midfield or maybe even over a little bit to the other side. But the Republicans are way behind their own goalpost right now. And if you look at a presidential primary process where John Huntsman was basically driven out of the race early because he was a conventional conservative Republican who would say things like, well, maybe scientists have a point. Maybe there is such a thing as climate change, but was outside what now passes for the mainstream in a nominating process. And Mitt Romney has taken a position on immigration that is embraced by Russell Pierce, the first Arizona legislator removed from office because of his extreme views on the position, but was the author of that Arizona immigration bill that Romney now says is a model for the rest of the nation, and embraces a litmus test that you don't raise taxes under any circumstances, and embraces as a litmus test that climate change is basically a hoax. It tells you where we are, and that's just a very different place. And it's a place that makes it almost impossible to compromise. Now, we point out, both in our Washington Post op-ed piece and in the book, that you can look for a lot of things, for the seeds of this. Some of it, of course, is in the dramatic regional realignment in the country that moved the South from being the bastion of Democrats, conservative Democrats, to now being the base of the Republican Party. The West Coast and New England from being strongholds for liberal Republicans into being the most blue regions in the country. Some of it is the emergence of the permanent campaign. But we also point out that Newt Gingrich, getting a lot of attention today, had a lot to do with how our politics have emerged. Not much of it intentional, but from the day Newt came to Washington, and we got to know him right at that point. Tom and I both had an association with the American Enterprise Institute in 1978, and we started a series of dinners with new members of the class of '78. Quite a remarkable group that we pulled together that included not just Newt Gingrich, but Dick Cheney and Geraldine Ferraro among them. But from the beginning, Newt had a full-blown strategy, complete with tactics, about how to reverse what was then a 25-year stranglehold that Democrats had on majorities in the House of Representatives. And it took him 16 years, but it was in effect, I'm going to destroy this institution in order to save it. Criminalizing of policy differences through the ethics process, polarizing and creating a tribal kind of category with a lot of help, by the way, from the Democrats, who, with all their time in office, had become condescending, complacent, and a little bit corrupt, and reacted and overreacted to some of the prodding that was done. But it helped to create a polarization. And then Newt went out and recruited candidates in the 90s who really believed what he was telling them, that this institution and our politics had grown corrupt and had gone off the rails. And even though when he made it work to become Speaker, he wanted to rein it back in and take over and make the institution powerful again, it created a set of forces and a new recruitment process and a new set of attitudes in the Republican Party, some of which, as his progeny came in and then moved over to the Senate, metastasized to the Senate. Just to give you one example, this happens to be a true story. Alan Simpson, a few years back, went back to visit the Senate and walked onto the Senate floor with Rick Santorum, who had come to the House in 1990 and then moved to the Senate in 1994. And when they went onto the floor, Simpson saw Dale Bumpers on the other side of the Senate floor and went over and embraced him warmly, and they had a nice conversation, and then looked over and saw Santorum, quite agitated, motioning him back. And Simpson went back a couple of minutes later and said, what's up? And Santorum said, what's that all about? And Simpson said, well, that's Dale Bumpers. He's one of my dearest friends. We're blood brothers. We work together on many things. We came in together. And Santorum said to him, we don't do things like that around here anymore. That's tribal politics. Now, I did ask Simpson, was that because you were embracing a guy or because you were embracing a Democrat? And it may be a little bit of both. But the fact is, we now live in a political world where ideas don't matter. It's who's expressing them. Tom mentioned the health issue. When you reach a point where you have a health bill that is almost entirely the Republican alternative to the Clinton health care plan from 1993, drafted not just by the late John Chafee and former Senator Dave Dernberger, but Orrin Hatch and Chuck Grassley in the Senate, combined with some elements of the Romney plan. And it is denounced by Grassley, Hatch, and almost everybody else, and now called socialism. Doesn't have a public option, is based on market principles, from the individual mandate coming out of the Heritage Foundation to the regulated insurance exchanges. But because it's proposed by Barack Obama, it doesn't get a single Republican vote in either house. And then you look at that self-same bill that has Alice Rivlin joining together with Paul Ryan that has Tom quite unhappy. But look at that bill. Now, it is regulated insurance exchanges with premium support and with Medicare as one option. I've asked many Republican audiences, regulated exchanges and premium support sounds a lot like the Affordable Care Act, but there's one difference. It's got a public option. So tell me why the Ryan-Wyden and related plan is wonderful, but the Affordable Care Act is socialism. And of course, it has only to do with who supports it, not what the ideas are. And if you look through a whole litany of things, you can see why we're alarmed. And of course, you know why, as we have critical problems facing the country, from the debt issue to healthcare to education to the state of the economy, the inability to come together, to collaborate and compromise, to find something that will work for the common good is deeply alarming. But you could also say, as many of our Republican colleagues have, well, the Democrats were the same. But if you look back, just to pick a couple of examples, when George Bush became president in 2001, after the most controversial and contested election in a century or more, after 36 days with a 5-4 polarizing vote in the Supreme Court, with extraordinarily close margins in Congress, no coattails, in fact, the opposite for the president. Democrats joined with the new president and made possible a quick and early and very important accomplishment for him that gave him legitimacy with No Child Left Behind. Couldn't have happened without Ted Kennedy and George Miller. The tax cuts would not have happened without pivotal support from Democrats in the Senate. All the bills that emerged in the aftermath of 9/11 were done almost unanimously. The Medicare prescription drug bill would never have emerged if it weren't for Ted Kennedy and Democrats in the Senate beginning a process, and a bill that got 74 votes in the Senate before it turned highly partisan when Republicans rejected most of the ideas in that bill to do their own in the House, in that famous vote that we described in detail in The Broken Branch that took almost 4 hours on the floor of the House at 3 a.m. And that's in deep contrast to what happened in 2009, where Barack Obama came in a landslide with huge coattails in both houses, a 70% approval rating upon inauguration, the worst set of economic conditions since the Great Depression. 3.5 weeks in, his initial approach, the stimulus package, did not get a single Republican vote in the House and got 3 in the Senate. And then we moved on to health care, to financial regulation, and a host of others, all of which divided totally along party lines. And in our system, that doesn't work. If you don't have broad bipartisan leadership consensus, as the late, great Daniel Patrick Moynihan pointed out so many times, you're not going to find great public support for things. We're not a parliamentary culture that accepts the legitimacy of the actions taken by a majority. If a minority knowingly decides to vote against and then to discredit and delegitimize those actions, you're going to have half the system that won't accept them. You get the move to repeal, and you can't even begin to implement policies that are lawfully enacted. All of that is what has left us dismayed, has left us saying that it's even worse than it looks, and has thrown us into quite a hornet's nest of dialogue and debate in the country. Thanks.
Well, that cheered you up, eh? Listen, now we haven't even begun to talk about the half of the book that deals with what to do about it, but we would love to have a conversation with you all. I'd like to turn to John Brademas for an initial question. John, would you get our conversation going here?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
So granted.
How do you see the forthcoming election?
I suppose what I see is a set of, the most likely outcome is a set of results that will intensify the dysfunctional dynamic in our politics and make it just as difficult to cope with them. That is to say, what I think is most likely is a modest re-election victory for President Obama, but Republicans holding the House and having a good shot at taking the Senate. If that happens, Republicans will be disappointed in their presidential run, but attribute it to the fact they didn't have a real conservative running and move further in that direction. Mind you, there would be some leverage for Obama under those circumstances because of the expiration of all of the tax cuts. So if they do just nothing, we've taken care of our deficit problem for the intermediate term. We've left the Affordable Care Program in place with the opportunities to get control of health care cost increases over time. But alas, it also comes with a substantial sequester, and the combination of the two could well throw our economy back into recession at the very beginning. But it's not promising. If in fact the economy sours, if we end up like Europe, many countries in Europe having a double-dip recession, I don't think we will. Republicans will enjoy a great victory across the board. And I think Mitt Romney will come into office and do what his party has pledged to do, which the public doesn't have a clue about and the implications of it. But given the way our system works with a midterm election that once again has many more Democrats running in the Senate than Republicans, it probably takes some time to sort of straighten that out. But I think they would aggressively use reconciliation to put in place more tax cuts and substantial reductions in programs, means-tested programs for the poor and disabled, especially the Medicaid program. The healthiest thing, and again, it's awkward for me to say this, it sounds so partisan, but the healthiest thing would be for the public to rein in the insurgent outlier. That is to say, give the Republicans a shellacking across the board, which would then empower other people within the Republican Party to come forward and provide some alternatives and begin to bring them sort of back into the world of reality and mainstream politics. And frankly, in those circumstances, I actually think that some Republican senators would say, I'm not sticking around here any longer just to oppose, and you might be able to actually get some work done. But it's one of those cases where you can't sort of, the public's going to have to speak with clarity if anything is to happen that is really constructive to our governing. Next question. Would you all come up to the mics and let her roll, please?
You've spoken about Congress, obviously, and the Senate, and by implication, the executive branch. I wonder if you could address what role you think the Supreme Court, the current Supreme Court, is playing in any of this, in any of what you've diagnosed here.
Well, the court has become a major part of a polarized and highly partisan political environment. A raft of highly significant decisions decided on a 5-4 vote, where the 5 now are Republican-appointed justices and the 4 are Democrats. We have an interesting dynamic now because in the remainder of the year, right in the height of the political season, we are going to have decisions not only on the Affordable Care Act, but on affirmative action. And there's a very substantial chance that the 5-4 vote, the same 5, the same 4, will throw out what remains of affirmative action in higher education, which is a delicate compromise forged by former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. We're going to get very possibly Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the preclearance provisions up. Chief Justice Roberts made it quite clear in earlier decisions that it's only a matter of time before that goes. And of course, right now, the Justice Department has used those provisions to throw out a couple of restrictive voter ID laws because they discriminated against minorities, and we've got redistricting cases up. We have another campaign finance case, the Montana case, and the court has another opportunity to rethink the havoc and disaster that has been brought upon us, starting with, although not limited to, Citizens United and some other cases that have followed from it. And all of those could well fall along 5-4 lines. It's one of the reasons why I actually think there's a real possibility that Roberts, in a calculating way, is going to look out there and see that if every one of these decisions is thrown into the middle of a political campaign, decided that way, it would cause grievous longer-term damage to the reputation of the court, which now has the lowest approval rating in 50 years. And so I think very likely the Affordable Care Act survives. so that it gives leeway to let the other ones go in that direction. The fact is, whatever happens with the remainder of the decisions this year, the court seems to be on a path where, unlike in prior decades, unlike the period when Brown v. Board of Education was up and the Supreme Court took 2 terms, 2 full years, because the justices ranging from left to right understood that it was healthier for the society, for a decision that was going to shake up the social fabric that way, to have it come out as a unanimous decision. There's no concern about that at all now. There's very little concern about having these 5-4 decisions, and that's going to continue to shake at the very legitimacy of the system, and it's one of the things that worries us so much that caused us to motivate us to write the book. Larry.
Larry.
Larry Mead from Politics. Thank you very much, Norm and Tom, for coming here and being truth tellers, not always a popular role. One thing you haven't spoken to is the reasons for the Republican move to the right. You mentioned Gingrich's role, but I'm looking for some more deeply seated reason, and I'm thinking of several motivations that might explain it, some of which we've seen discussed in the press. One of them is that the Republicans, and especially the Tea Party movement, think that Obama is a radical, that he's trying to change America in some radical manner. A second theory might be that there's panic over the deficit and the belief that the country is headed over a cliff financially. A third reason might be the culture wars, various social issues like abortion, which are deeply divisive and which have become more pressing. And a fourth reason might be that there's a generalized rebellion against the perceived elitism of Washington, that we now have a populist movement on the right, not the left, which somehow believes that the opinion makers in Washington are members of a sort of Mandarin class that is out of touch with America. And I wonder if those or any other theory might explain this, to me, remarkable move to the right and also move to rigidity.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry. I'm glad you asked that question. It turns out we really have a whole chapter in the book that tries to wrestle with this, and we find it useful to really put it into sort of two pieces, almost 2 periods. Sort of one really has developed over a period of decades. It really began with the counterculture of the 60s and the reaction to it, the Voting Rights Act, which set in motion a dramatic change within the Democratic Party and in the South, the Roe versus Wade abortion decision, the anti-tax movement in California in the late 1970s. All of these events sort of set in motion all kinds of patterns of behavior, of residential mobility. Over this period, we see individuals moving into neighborhoods that are more like them, that share the same values. So it's not that you have red versus blue states as much as neighborhoods, and you build up sort of areas of strong agreement. We know from fascinating psychological research, and Cass Sunstein has done this, is that when you're in a like-minded group, you tend to be less inclined to listen to someone with another point of view. That is, it moves you to reinforce the set of sentiments that existed, and I think that has happened. We have a wonderful book called The Big Sort that goes into some of these developments. That we also saw then different interest groups which heretofore had worked with both parties, pick one or the other. You're with us or against us. Many of them were on social issues, but also on some economic issues. Then we saw the emergence of talk radio, led initially by the conservatives and still dominated by them, to cable news, partisan cable news, and sort of the just relentless 24-hour-a-day crossfire debates that tended to reinforce this. Different kind of people got recruited to Congress. They they were more like-minded within their parties. They gave power to the leadership to act decisively. The party platforms became much more distinctive, sending signals to the electorate. So you got this long-term dynamic that was playing out that was affecting both parties, but on the Republican side, it was more intense. I'd say the supply side sort of ideas at the late 70s, early 80s really began to take hold. Ironically, Reagan was pretty much a pragmatist in signing tax increases. If no one knew his name or his history and he ran as he governed, he wouldn't have a chance in the contemporary Republican Party. So that, and then Newt added to that sort of dynamic. But then we really hit a period in which the movement that has been seen as sort of right-wing populist movement throughout American history was present in the 1950s in California. Sheila, my wife, did a dissertation on the radical right in California during that period, but they were active in the Goldwater movement, and sort of, if you were, they were vegetating, and you saw a buildup of apparatus of think tanks and other organizations beginning to champion some of those issues. But Clinton was a turning point in all of this and the Republican success in 1994. There was really a fear that, hey, Republicans had at least been winning these presidential elections and gained control of Congress, but Bill Clinton was successful. He didn't get a single Republican vote on his budget plan, even though it looked almost exactly like Bush 41's plan, which also didn't get many, more than a handful of Republican votes to deal with the budget. So then you come up to an economic collapse. There's fear. There have always been people sort of in the middle who have a certain amount of resentment for redistributive programs to the poor, and they became activated and angry. And I just think this whole thing has played out in that fashion. As we say, the changes in the Democratic Party occurred sort of much earlier as the Dixiecrats left and other changes occurred. Since then, they've been operating sort of pretty level ideologically. It was the two-part movement over decades of the Republican Party that I think produced these changes.
Let me just reflect on it a couple of minutes as well, Larry. It's a really good question. Of course, the great irony that you have this Republican culture, that there's in Washington a group of mandarins who are out of touch with the common person. So Mitt Romney is the guy that we're going to pick to move us away from all of that. But I do think there's a different political culture for conservatives and Republicans than there is for liberals and Democrats. That goes back a number of decades, and it's built on some realities, which is this sense over many decades that it was the liberal intellectual establishment that dominated the major institutions of the country. It dominated the university community, it dominated the media, it dominated the entertainment industry, and almost everything else. And that's really deep-seated. And there's still some truth to some elements of it. But of course, when you hear conservatives fulminate about the liberal dominance of the media, when Fox News is the biggest money maker of them all, and when they've got a robust group of media of their own, it just tells you how much this is just ingrained as a kind of worldview. But if it's there as a worldview, then it makes it even more difficult for conservatives who believe that you still got to find some common ground or solve problems or compromise to push back against what has now become an echo chamber that resonates so much and that has been reinforced by the new media. The Fox business model, the Rush Limbaugh business model that now has morphed out into a whole bunch of blogs, the Daily Caller and others, make money and thrive by reinforcing this tribal political nature. And then I think you can throw in something else. And by the way, what's so interesting to us is we talk to a lot of quite conservative Republican former office holders. As soon as they leave office, it's like they've stopped breathing a gas, and they look at what their former colleagues are doing and they can't believe it. They can't believe they're supporting some of the things that they're supporting or that they're acting the way they are. So it gets into this hothouse environment. And part of the frustration that we have is that even though you have no moderate or liberal Republicans in the House, period. They just don't exist anymore. Mike Castle was the last one. You've got less than a handful in the Senate. But I could go on to into the House and find 30 or 40 House Republicans who are problem solvers, whose instinct is to figure out how you can solve some of those problems. And you could find 15 Republicans in the Senate. And you've seen a couple of them emerge in odd ways. Mike Crapo and Saxby Chambliss, and even Tom Coburn, who really is the limiting case, willing to put themselves on the line and actually say revenues have to be a part of the solution. You could look at the reality that every outside group that gets together that spans the spectrum says the way in which we deal with our debt problem is obvious. There's a template here. $4 trillion over 10 years, a third to a half has to come from revenues. Almost everybody outside knows that. Put it inside, and even those who believe it are forced away from doing it. And that's a different set of attitudes. Some of the Democrats, at least, were willing to openly raise Medicare as an issue that had to be on the table. Obama was even ready to put Social Security on the table, to the great displeasure of his own leaders. But if you look at all the detailed accounts of what happened in the debt limit debacle, when Obama went to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid and said, here's the deal that I think we're going to agree to, they swallowed hard and said, we'll try and make it get through. But you just don't have that on a Republican side. And people who come into this process, like a John Huntsman, who try to just tilt even a little bit. And you know, Huntsman was not exactly strong on the tax issue in terms of raising the revenues, to say the least. Many of the things that he put out there were kind of standard issue that would have been perfectly acceptable to Reagan when he was first running. But now it's a different culture and a different world. And while it's true that Democrats have some elements of this, you could see at least a couple of instances where Blue Dog Democrats just last week lost in Pennsylvania 2 seats, incumbents, to progressives. In one instance, at least, it never would have happened without massive redistricting. But you put that up against what's occurring on the other side. And we mentioned one example of a Tea Party freshman who's being challenged from the right for being too squishy, a Mississippi Republican. And I got an email after that from John Barry, who's a wonderful author who's written these books on the flood and on the flu epidemic and the like, who lives in New Orleans. And he said, you know, I interviewed him about the flood, the fellow that we mentioned who's being challenged from the right. He said, and if this guy's being challenged from the right, he said to me, you know, it was only a few years ago that I came to realize that Herbert Hoover was a socialist. And he's being challenged because he's too moderate. That's a very different phenomenon than what we see on the other side.
Yes, please.
What can we do to change this? What's happening?
Yeah. Let me say, the question was, what can we do to change what's happening? 3 things that I'd single out. One is be active on behalf of efforts to increase the size of the electorate and oppose any efforts to decrease it. We have sort of strategic efforts to mobilize and demobilize parts of the electorate, which end up having a kind of pernicious influence on our politics. You know, it happens somewhat naturally in primary elections, but it also happens in general elections, something you don't see in a country like Australia, which has mandatory attendance at the polls, 95%. The they have sort of polarizing tendencies and issues, extreme issues, but in general, the conversation, the real political conversation, doesn't occur in a loony area. It occurs somewhere among reasonable people fighting for swing voters because you can't bank on a whole lot of people just not voting. So all kinds of ideas about that. Norm has been lately sort of pushing the idea of a lottery. It seems kind of hokey, but in our country it might work. Second thing, really be outspoken and angry at your news organizations when they treat the Senate as a 60-vote threshold in the Senate as just the norm, the rules of the system. That's the way the framers intended. No such thing. They assume majority votes for everything except the specific provisions in which they required supermajorities, and yet now we have individual senators, treated as champions in their states for putting holes on things in order to accomplish something else. It's such an outrageous abuse of power. Why don't Iowans stand up to Charles Grassley? He's been outrageous on this, more so than most anyone else lately. So try to get away from the notion that 60 votes is normal, that sort of filibusters are great and protect minority rights. They don't do anything of the sort. The third is to think through the whole notion of divided party government in an era of depolarization. In the past, polarization has worked pretty well. I mean, divided government has occasionally worked well, but it can't under these circumstances. Get your friends and neighbors to think through. Decide it on the basis of the team running for president, who you want, and then support their party down the line and put someone in a position to be able to govern. Norm?
Right, we have one more
one
question.
last
We can only
question
take
here.
one more.
Apparently, we're
Yeah.
running out of time, I'm sorry to say. You want to speak at the mic here? Yeah.
Sorry, I want to thank you for that first, because I think for most of us here who do identify as liberals or Democrats, that actually gives us a hold on what we can do, not just looking at the faults of the other side, but also what we can do to contribute to bettering the process. But my question has to do with what you brought up at the beginning, that something that I hear a lot from peers of mine here at NYU, and that the idea that there is something that's very fundamentally the same about everybody, and as a result of that, many people have come to this conclusion that what needs to happen is to rather put pressure outside of the system, not to try and work within the bounds of this two-party system, or to try and work with Democrats, or try and change the points of view of the very people that we've elected into the system, but some kind of external way of attacking it, largely which seems to have been manifested through attacking the private financial sector. What would you have to say to those people who think that that is actually the fundamental problem, and that what's going on in Congress is actually some kind of second-order thing, to get them on board with the suggestion that you have for us?
Well, there's a lot of frustration out there. One of the things I would say more generally is, and it gets back to the question of what to do, we need voters, as a general matter, to move away from the idea that anybody who stands up and says, I'm not like the rest of them, gets traction. When somebody like Herman Cain, who is utterly unsuited for public office, emerges with a boomlet because he says, I don't speak politician, that's a phenomenon that we've seen more and more, and we're leaching out of the system people who can find common ground or respect their own institutions, what the framers would have proudly called politicians. So that's one part of it. Getting to what you talked about, we're seeing now a major sentiment among many, including many intellectuals like Tom Friedman and Matt Miller, that maybe it's time for an independent movement, a third party. And so the Americans Elect movement has moved forward. We have a chapter in our book called Bromides to Avoid, and that's right at the top of the list. And while I do think that the frustration can lead to outside movements, and those outside movements can have an impact. The Tea Party movement has had a very significant impact. It focused in a very different way than Occupy Wall Street did. But actually there's an amazing amount of common ground, as there is with populists more generally. But what Occupy Wall Street has done is to help to change the agenda to a degree. And the focus that we're now having on the 1% and the 99%, where I saw it most clearly was when the chairman of the the publisher of the Manchester Union Leader, the most conservative newspaper in New Hampshire, announced before the primary there that the paper was going to endorse Newt Gingrich and not Mitt Romney. And he said, well, we like Mitt, but he's the embodiment of the 1%. That was a triumph for the Occupy Wall Street movement, when you get people who talk about 1% and 99% in that way. But if it's all just a matter of having an impact, significant but still at the margins on the agenda, and if you turn your attention away from the institutions that can profoundly affect everybody's future. If we reach a point, for example, it's going to be not a focus on outside the Congress and Wall Street, but you reach a point where there's a decision made in Congress and with the concurrence of the president to cut Medicaid by 30% and turn it into a block grant back to the states. Every one of your grandparents or others that you know who are in nursing homes, which happens to be the single largest component of Medicaid, are suddenly going to find, because there's no magic that's going to provide the same services for 30% less money, and especially when the states are going to lose their state and local tax deduction at the same time, that your grandmother, instead of having one nurse's aide for every 4 patients, is going to have one for every 40. That's not something you can affect by having simply an outside protest movement. People have to understand that the critical decisions that are going to shape our lives, from higher education and student loans to programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, to what happens in the global economy, are shaped by the political institutions. If you don't change those, then you are really spitting or doing something else into the wind.
Let me just pick up, if I can. I think it's such an important question. It's not either or. It's both. I think the great changes that occur in society are ultimately made possible, if not driven by initially, then supported and sustaining activities of social movements. And so I think their emergence and individuals participating in them is absolutely critical. We live at a time of sort of extraordinary inequality. It's a reality, and we've had most Americans sort of stuck for decades with no real income growth and a sense of declining opportunities. But it's tough. It's tough to first figure out what to do and then to do something about it. But at least putting the issue on the table has made a huge difference, as Norm has said. But I think it would be a tragedy for people who invest their energies in that kind of activity to conclude there's no difference between the Democratic and Republican Party. That, in effect, removes you from having any real impact on the system. Political parties are absolutely instrumental to framing choices for resolution by the electorate, and so that has to be part of the picture while these social movements get up and running. They provide a necessary ingredient, but by no means sufficient to deal with the problems we face. Well, listen, we would love to go on, but we're being told we got to call it here.
We're happy to take individual questions individually.
Happy to chat with you. Thank you all.